In our last lesson, we learned about the scientific method or the experimental method, which begins with observation. Observation is simply information that's gathered by our senses, and it's often aided by tools such as rulers or thermometers. And then we move on to the hypothesis phase. We make a hypothesis, which is more than just an educated guess, about what is going to result when we make a change in a portion of our experiment. So the hypothesis is testable, and it also needs to include some sort of prediction, such as I believe the rate's going to increase by 20% if I make this particular change. Then we move on to the experiment phase of the scientific method. That's simply a procedure designed to test the hypothesis that we have come up with. It should only test a single variable, and that is the factor that is believed to be the cause of the effect. And it should include two groups, an experimental group, which is the tested variable, and that is changed, and then the control group, where the tested variable is kept at a constant rate. After we've done the experiment, and really while we're doing the experiment, we're collecting data, we're analyzing that data now. So that data is gathered information during the experiment, and it's vital that it be kept accurate. After we've gathered that data, we're going to organize that data to see if there's correlations. And we're going to talk about correlations today. And we classify them usually in groups because we can often learn about the entire group by studying just a small portion of that group. So classification is important. And we may also use tables and graphs that will help us determine what variables and how those variables are changing. After we've done that, we make some sort of conclusion. So we compare our hypothesis to our experimental results. The goal is for the experiment and the data to either confirm or repel our hypothesis. Many times the result of a single experiment is not good enough, and so we may have to do this experiment a multiplicity of times. So we keep on repeating it. The more that we experiment with it, the stronger and the better our results are going to be. And then we need to communicate those results. Often this is done through scientific journals, scientific articles. It should include the question that was explored, the reason why we feel that this particular topic is so important, some background information, and then maybe a precise description of the work that was done, the data that we collected, even if it's just in a average form or a whole collection form, and then the scientist's interpretation of that data. What was the end result? And so that's what we covered in the last lesson. Today we're going to look at the scientific method a little bit further, looking at correlations. So let's take a look at the correlation method. The correlation is dependence of two factors upon each other. There are several downsides to the scientific method, and there are very big limitations. For instance, we cannot determine past events. So we don't know why a certain event occurred in the past, and there's really no way to test it because it happened in the past. Why did the dinosaurs go extinct? Well, we can come up with ideas, but there's really no exact experiment that we can do to determine why they went extinct. We also can't determine if something is unethical. So for instance, if we wanted to find out, well, what is the lethal dosage of mercury in a human? Well, it would be unethical for us to induce mercury into an individual for the sole purpose of determining at what point would they die. So those things we would consider unethical. The Germans during the Holocaust did a lot of unethical experiments during that time. But as a scientist, we don't feel as though that is a correct way of doing things. So when those type of events occur, we have to use a correlation method. Correlation is simply the dependence of two factors upon each other. So when direct experimentation is impossible or unethical, we may be able to draw conclusions based on correlations. And this is often, as I mentioned, used to determine historical events. The downside to the correlation method is that it doesn't really prove anything. There may be a lot of other factors that come into play that may also affect our results. Correlation does not necessarily prove causation, but as we increase the experiments, the more and more data that we come up with, the more likely that correlation is going to be true. So as an example of the correlation method, there were two colonies that were founded here in America in the past that did not survive, or at least did not survive very well. The first one was the lost colony of Roanoke Island back in 1587 to 1589. And the second one was in Jamestown, where the vast majority of those that went to Jamestown did not survive very long. That was in 1606 to 1612. Well, as we look at tree rings and we go back in time based on tree rings, we do know that the thinner the band on the tree ring, the less growing that tree did during that year. Generally speaking, that would indicate that there wasn't as much rainfall. Well, if we look at the lost colony of Roanoke and the Jamestown, they were both founded during one of the worst droughts in American history in that location. So can we conclude that these droughts caused those particular colonies to not succeed as well as they could have? No, but there is a good correlation that those events may have happened and had an effect on that. As many of you probably have guessed, scientists sometimes just have a different way of thinking. So we're going to take a look at several scientific habits of the mind. The first of which is what we consider curiosity. Curiosity breeds investigation. It spawns that looking for things that other people wouldn't necessarily look for. If you aren't curious, you're not going to ask questions. You're not going to wonder why this happens or why that happens. And so curiosity is a key scientific habit of the mind. Skepticism is another key habit. We don't believe everything we hear. It's good to be skeptical on many, many aspects. If you just take everything at face value, you don't know whether somebody is actually lying, whether they're misrepresenting the truth, or whether they're seemingly telling the truth, but they don't even realize that what they're giving is a lie. As an example, in the 1800s, it was once thought that men and women breathed differently. It was believed that men used the diaphragm and that women used the upper chamber of their ribs in order to breathe. Well, a doctor started studying this and realized that women and men do breathe differently, but not because they were designed that way, but because of the clothes that the women were wearing. During the 1800s, it was very fashionable for women to wear the girdles. They would pull them very tight to thin their waist down, and because of that, that put excess pressure on their abdomen to where they couldn't use their diaphragm properly, and so they had to breathe differently. It wasn't because God designed the bodies different, it was because of the clothing that they wore. So she was skeptical over the things on why women breathe differently. We also need to be open to new ideas. This is one that I fear has kind of gone by the wayside in this whole COVID epidemic. There are a lot of scientists out there that I don't think are really open to ideas. And then intellectual honesty. This is another big issue that a lot of people have today. Intellectual honesty. The ability to admit that they're wrong. It used to be a scientist would try to prove themselves incorrect. They would design their experiments to disprove what they were trying to prove. And now we see the reverse of that. They're trying to design experiments to prove what they're trying to prove. They need to have some intellectual honesty. I'm not perfect. I make mistakes. What I believe to be true may not actually be true. Imagination and creativity is another key scientific habit of the mind. As we went out and we observed the area in your last lab where you were drawing the map of our hydroponics area, some of you were more creative and imaginative than others. I'm not just talking about the artistic ability that you had or didn't have, but the observation of smaller items, how things worked. You were able to get that into your lab, whereas others may have skipped it or didn't notice it at all. So imagination and creativity can also create a lot of new ideas and a lot of new ways of testing things. Let me give you an example of John Snow. John Snow lived in the mid 1800s during the cholera epidemic in London. And there were a lot of people that were dying from cholera. Now, cholera is a bacterium caused by a bacterium from human feces that's in water. And so there were a lot of deaths that were occurring, and John Snow decided he would think a little bit differently about this. So he got a map of London, and he marked where all the deaths from cholera occurred. And when he did that, he noticed that there was a large concentration of deaths around the Broad Street water pump. And so upon noticing this, he had the authorities there in London remove the handle from that pump, forcing people to go to other wells in order to get their water. And lo and behold, the number of deaths dropped dramatically. So because he thought differently about a situation, he was able to save hundreds, perhaps even thousands of lives during the cholera epidemic, all because of his scientific habit of the mind of creativity. So today what we've learned is the correlation method to look at the cause and the effect, keeping in mind that just because there's a correlation doesn't necessarily mean there is causation. There could be other factors in play. And we also looked at the 5 key habits of the mind: curiosity, skepticism, openness to new ideas, intellectual honesty, and imagination or creativity.